Lexi Hull doing it all on that defensive possession. Clark. Oh! From another stratosphere!
The Golden State Valkyries got Caitlin Clark, and their post-game excuses are the most embarrassing thing you'll hear all season. There is a very specific kind of energy that fills a locker room after you have just been absolutely cooked by the best player in the building. It is not the quiet dignity of a team that competed hard and lost to a superior opponent on a given night. It is not the humble acknowledgement that someone on the other side of the court did something special and you were there to witness it up close and personal. It is not the honest, direct, professional admission that a great player made great plays, and that is why the final score looks the way it does. No, the specific energy we are talking about today is something altogether different. It is the energy of a team standing in front of microphones trying to convince the world, and possibly themselves, that what just happened did not happen the way it happened. It is the energy of a coach leaning into a pre-game talking point about physicality while the scoreboard behind her is showing an 8-point loss. It is the energy of a player suggesting that the defeat had nothing to do with anyone on the other team, that it was entirely self-inflicted, purely a matter of their own mistakes, on a night when the opponent just made WNBA history with her individual performance. That is the energy coming out of the Golden State Valkyries locker room after Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever walked into their building, handled their business, completed a second-half comeback, and left with a 90-82 victory. And today, we are going to go through every single layer of that post-game reaction, pull it apart piece by piece, and talk honestly about what it reveals. Not just about this game, but about a persistent pattern in how certain people in and around this league choose to talk about Caitlin Clark when she makes them look bad, which, based on the first 5 games of this season, is happening with historically unprecedented frequency. Let us begin where every honest sports conversation has to begin, which is with what actually happened on the floor, because the facts of this game are the foundation of everything else, and the facts need to be stated clearly before we can properly evaluate any of the post-game commentary that followed. Caitlin Clark finished Friday night's game against the Golden State Valkyries with 22 points, 9 assists, and 2 rebounds in 32 minutes of playing time. The Indiana Fever won by a final score of 90-82, capping a second-half comeback that required heart, adjustment, and execution under pressure. And as has been reported across sports outlets covering the WNBA with the kind of attention this league is now receiving, Clark's performance was not just impressive by the standards of a single game. It was historically significant in a way that needs to be spoken about with the weight it actually carries. Caitlin Clark became the first player in WNBA history to record 20 points and 5 assists in each of the first 5 games of a season. The first player in the entire history of this league. Not in recent memory. Not in the past decade. Not since the salary cap changed or the rules shifted or the expansion teams joined. In the entire history of the Women's National Basketball Association, no player has ever done what Caitlin Clark has done in the opening 5 games of this season. Every single game. Not 4 out of 5, not 3 out of 5 with 2 close calls. Every single one. 20 points and 5 assists minimum in each of the first 5 games. That is not a hot streak. Hot streaks end. That is not variance working in someone's favor. Variance does not sustain itself across 5 consecutive historic performances. What that is, if you are willing to call it what it actually is a player operating at a level that this league has genuinely never seen in the same combination of scoring output and playmaking consistency across an opening stretch of games. The Golden State Valkyries were the 5th team to serve as the backdrop for this historic run. They got a front-row seat to history, and they left with a loss on their record and some very interesting things to say to reporters afterwards. Now, let us talk about Natalie Nakase, because the Valkyries head coach had an interesting week in terms of how she approached this matchup publicly. In the pre-game press conference, Nakase was detailed, specific, and genuinely comprehensive in her breakdown of what the Valkyries were planning to do against Clark. She talked about picking Clark up further from the basket than you would normally guard a player, because Clark's shooting range extends far enough from the logo that giving her normal perimeter space is essentially handing her comfortable looks. She acknowledged openly that guarding Clark at the standard 3-point line distance is problematic because that range is not a stretch for Clark the way it would be for most players. It is her comfort zone. She talked about forcing Clark to go left. She talked about applying physicality. She talked about it needing to be a full-team defensive commitment because the Fever play at a pace that makes single-player solutions ineffective. This was a prepared, thoughtful, professionally delivered pre-game scouting summary. If you were watching it as a basketball fan, you would come away thinking, all right, this coach has done her homework. She has a real plan, and she is going to put the Valkyries in a position to execute it. Then the game happened. Clark put up 22 and 9. The Fever won by 8. And then, Nakase walked back in front of the microphones for the post-game press conference, and the message was essentially that the Valkyries had been disruptive, that they had been physical, and that Clark does not like physicality. That was the post-game analysis. That was the summary of what happened and why. After all of that detailed, specific, comprehensive pre-game preparation talk, the post-game boiled down to the disruption and physicality angle and the idea that Clark's relationship with physical play was somehow a factor in the outcome. And I genuinely need to spend some time on this, because that particular talking point, that specific narrative about Clark and physicality, is one that has been circulating in certain conversations around this league for well over a year, and it needs to be examined seriously and challenged directly every single time it surfaces. Here is the core claim being made when someone says Caitlin Clark does not like physicality. The claim is that if you are sufficiently physical with Clark, if you make the game hard and uncomfortable and rough for her, she will struggle. She will be disrupted. Her performance will decline. The physicality will translate into results on the scoreboard. That is the argument. That is what the narrative is actually asserting. And here is why the scoreboard from Friday night makes that argument genuinely incoherent. If the Valkyries were being physical and disruptive, and if Clark does not handle physicality well, then the expected outcome of a game where the Valkyries successfully executed their physical disruptive approach against a player who struggles with it should be a game where Clark struggles. It should be a game where Clark's points go down, where her assists go down, where her efficiency drops, where the physicality and disruption translate into visible negative consequences for her performance. What actually happened is that Clark scored 22 points and dished 9 assists. Those numbers went up compared to league averages. Those numbers made WNBA history. The historic individual performance that made Clark the first player ever to hit 20 and 5 in each of the first 5 games of a season happened in the same game where the Valkyries were apparently being physical and disruptive. If this is what a bad game for Clark looks like when teams are successfully physical with her, then every single team in this league should be absolutely terrified of what happens when she is fully comfortable and operating in a game where nobody is being physical with her. Because the ceiling on that performance would apparently be something genuinely otherworldly. The fact that the physicality and disruption narrative survived contact with a 22-9 performance and still got trotted out in the post-game press conference tells you something important. It tells you the narrative is not primarily about basketball analysis. If it were about basketball analysis, the data would have killed it already. 22 points is not a player being disrupted into a bad shooting night. 9 assists is not a player being disrupted out of her playmaking rhythm. A second-half comeback win is not the result of the opposing team successfully executing a disruptive defensive strategy. The data does not support the narrative, and yet the narrative persists. It persists because it is serving a function that has nothing to do with honest basketball analysis. It is serving as a framework that allows people to talk about Clark's games in a way that stops just short of fully crediting her for what she is doing. And that framework, that persistent reluctance to just look at the numbers and say this player is exceptional and we did not have an answer for her tonight, is something that deserves to be called out clearly and consistently. Let us specifically address the Janelle Salon situation as it relates to this physicality conversation, because it is directly relevant and it adds a layer to the post-game Nakase comments that cannot be ignored. In the same game where the Valkyries were supposedly being appropriately physical and disruptive as a strategic defensive approach, Salon shoved Clark in the back. Not a hard defensive foul in the act of shooting, not a physical screen, not an aggressive contest on a jump shot. She shoved her in the back. Clark, who has a documented back issue that kept her out of the previous game and had her listed as probable right up until the morning of this game, got physically shoved in the back by an opposing player in the middle of the game. Clark reacted to that. She confronted Salon. There was an exchange. The officials assessed a technical foul, and in one of the most remarkable developments of the entire week, Clark did not even know she had received it until a reporter told her in the post-game press conference. But the broader point here is that what the Valkyries were doing physically in this game was not all clean, smart, within the rules defensive physicality. Some of it crossed into the territory of a shove to the back of a player with a documented back injury. And that did not stop Clark from scoring 22 points and dishing 9 assists. So when we hear the post-game framing about physicality being a strategic choice and Clark not handling it well, we need to hold that framing up against the complete picture of what was happening on that floor. The picture is not flattering for the narrative. Now let us get to Tiffany Hayes, because Hayes had some things to say in the postgame that generated significant reaction online, and that reaction was justified in ways that deserve a careful examination rather than just a dismissal. Hayes, when asked about the game and Clark's performance, steered her answer toward the idea that the loss was about the Valkyries' own mistakes their own defensive breakdowns, their own execution problems. She essentially communicated that the blame for the outcome rested with what Golden State failed to do, rather than what Indiana succeeded in doing. And in the most pointed version of that framing, she said something to the effect of it being no one else, meaning the attribution for the loss went entirely to her own team's failures and not to the opponent's excellence. Now, there is a version of this approach that is legitimate and even admirable in professional sports. Taking ownership of a loss, refusing to make excuses, looking internally for what your team can improve rather than pointing fingers at officials or opposing players, all of that reflects a healthy team culture and a professional mindset that is genuinely worth respecting. The best coaches and players in every sport will tell you that the only thing you can control is your own preparation and execution, and that the habit of looking externally for explanations for your failures is a habit that will keep you from making the improvements you need to make. That philosophy is sound. That philosophy wins championships when it is applied honestly and consistently. But there is an important distinction between applying that philosophy honestly and using the language of that philosophy as a rhetorical tool to avoid giving credit where credit is undeniably, historically, statistically, and visually due. And when Tiffany Hayes suggests that a loss in which Caitlin Clark set WNBA records and finished with 22 points and 9 assists was purely a product of the Valkyries' own mistakes with no meaningful contribution from Clark's individual excellence, she has crossed from the first version of that philosophy into the second. Here is the most direct way to make this point. It is not no one else. It is very specifically someone else. The someone is Caitlin Clark. She is the player who pulled up from logo range and knocked down shots that most players in this league simply cannot attempt, let alone convert at a meaningful rate. She is the player who threaded passes through coverage gaps to find open teammates in ways that required both vision and the kind of decision-making speed that comes from a player operating at the absolute peak of her basketball intelligence. She is the player who, in the fourth quarter of a close game when the pressure was highest and the stakes were clearest, made the right plays consistently enough that her team came back from a deficit and closed the game out. You cannot look at that sequence of events and honestly say it was purely about your own team's mistakes. The mistakes matter, the defensive breakdowns matter, the execution problems matter, and they need to be addressed. But those mistakes were happening in the context of an opponent who was doing things on the floor that made those mistakes more likely, more costly, and harder to recover from. Caitlin Clark created some of those mistakes. Caitlin Clark punished those mistakes when they happened. Caitlin Clark made plays that well-executed defense would have still had trouble stopping, because that is what great players do, and none of that gets captured in the framing of it as no one else. What makes the Hayes comment land with particular awkwardness, beyond just the intellectual honesty question, is the timing and the context in which it was delivered. This was not a situation where a player lost to a decent opponent in a competitive game and was looking for ways to be constructive about it in the postgame. This was a situation where Clark had just completed the 5th game of a historically unprecedented opening stretch to her season. The record was sitting right there. The numbers were right there. The context was right there for anyone who had been paying even casual attention to what was happening in the WNBA this season. And into that context, with all of that history hanging over the postgame, Hayes chose the framing of no one else. The internet noticed. The reaction was swift and pointed. And honestly, the reaction was proportionate to the comment. Because when you dismiss a historic performance that directly contributed to your team's loss as essentially incidental, you should expect the people watching to have opinions about that.
Lexi Hull doing it all on that defensive possession. Clark, oh, from another stratosphere!